When times change, someone is always the last to know. In the evolution of justice, it seems Australia's serial laggard was Pentridge Prison. It was the site of the last usage of the cat o' nine tails and the last execution by hanging in Australia. In what is today the inner northern Melbourne suburb of Coburg, a few structures, surrounded by largely symbolic fencing, were built by prisoners in 1850, coming to form what became known as the Pentridge Stockade. Locals were unimpressed, not only that a minimum security prison had appeared right next to them, but also that the area, then known as the Pentridge District, would become a synecdoche for the jail. The latter issue would be addressed with the renaming of the area to Coburg, from the House of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, the house of the British royal family. The gold rush of the late 1850s saw Melbourne's population more than double, and criminals began to fill up existing infrastructure, including the Melbourne Jail and prison hulks moored near Williamstown. This necessitated the construction of permanent buildings and proper perimeter walls. Prisoners were initially kept in their cells for up to 23 hours a day, with an hour allocated for prisoners to exercise in an airing yard. Over time, sentiment changed as governments realised that prisoners could be used as free labour, with inmates at Pentridge being put to work in various industries. Even today, Victorian licence plates continue to be produced at Hopkins Correctional Centre in Ararat. Pentridge's different divisions housed different types of prisoners. B Division was home to difficult prisoners, while short-term prisoners were kept in F Division and C Division, the latter being home to Ned Kelly when he was imprisoned in 1871 for feloniously receiving a horse. Perhaps the most well-known part of Pentridge, for its detention of such names as Mark Chopper Reed and Russell Street bomber Stanley Taylor, is H Division. Opened in 1958 in the wake of several escapes, H Division was designed to be the place for escape-prone and dangerous inmates. The conditions were poor, and the relationship between prisoners and guards was worse. Murder, violence and suicide were everyday occurrences. Father John Brosnan, a chaplain at Pentridge, believed that the physical and psychological brutality of H Division turned bike thieves into murderers. Lessons from H Division were not learned in the construction and operation of the next maximum security block, which would be Pentridge's last. The new division, which was called Jika Jika, was built in 1980 at a cost of $7 million, with the goal of being both more secure and more humane than the ageing H Division. It was supposed to be a modern prison, but was still based on the almost 200-year-old panopticon design. Its 54 cells were divided across 6 units, which were connected by a series of doors which would only open when the previous door had closed. These areas between doors were called locks. In his book on Pentridge, Rupert Mann notes the similarity of its design to a lunar colony. It was fitted with state-of-the-art security technologies, including remotely operated doors, security cameras, bulletproof observation areas, and a stellar screen energy field. All this tech meant that operating costs were high for the facility, so Pentridge saved money by cutting the number of officers staffing it, with prisoners sometimes spending up to 22 hours a day in their cell as a result. The root of this unpleasantness stemmed from the ideology that guided the facility's design and operation, a program of harsh conditions and inhumane treatment aimed to engender behavioural modification. This was achieved through the use of sensory deprivation, isolation, segregation, and omniscient surveillance. The regime was designed to break down the mental defences of prisoners through its physical structure and through a psychologically caustic regime. It was theorised that this would render the individual malleable, and therefore able to be shaped into an acceptable member of society. Prisoners slept on a concrete bed, and guards would close doors at random, often leaving prisoners stuck in corridors or locks for extended periods. Air conditioning, a fairly modern convenience for a prison at the time, was set to blow hot air in the summer and cold air in the winter. The noise of showers left running by guards echoed against the concrete walls, and there would be no hot water left by the next morning. Floor sweepings and cigarette butts often found their way into meals. It is no wonder then that the inmates yearned to be free. From the 19th century solitary confinement cells, which were constructed underground and known as blind cells due to their total darkness, to the reception biff of H Division, where new inmates would be stripped and beaten by guards, Pentridge had a long history of punitive justice that was continued by Jika. In the 3 years after Jika's construction, there were no less than 7 escapes from Pentridge's other facilities. By 1983, escapes were coming by the month. In January, 2 prisoners absconded during a prison swimming competition. In April, 4 men who had stolen prison blueprints used workshop tools to break out of J Division. At that point, however, Jika had still not had a successful escape. Jika was reserved for the most dangerous and escape-prone inmates in Pentridge. In mid-1983, 4 men who matched both descriptors began to plot an escape that would shake the foundations of Victorian politics and policing. Among them were Robert Lindsay Wright. Perhaps by virtue of the primacy of his heinousness, he appears to have been the leader of the group. He was first convicted for armed robbery. He escaped and, while on the run, killed 3 people, including a 10-year-old boy. At 27, he had already escaped Pentridge twice. Once by hiding himself under a pile of rubbish in a garbage truck, and had flown the coop at B Division after climbing a wall with a rope. On his chest, the words sex and grog were tattooed. David McGawley was born in Belfast and was, like Wright, serving a life sentence. In 1979, McGawley had shot, bashed and run over Peter Darrington after, according to Wendy Lewis in her book Jailbreak, he was offered $100 by a woman in Bundoora to murder her one-legged brother-in-law and ex-lover to get him out of the fucking house. McGawley was part of the swimming competition escape in January 1983. He had climbed a perimeter wall using a grappling hook made of sprinkler pipes and masking tape. Michael Timothy John Neville, while not a killer, made up for it by being the group's most prolific escape artist. The armed robber's 4 escapes, including McGawley's escape in January, made him a valuable addition to the team. He had extricated himself from the custody of officers of the Supreme Court by employing what the Age referred to as a homemade key to unlock his handcuffs. David Robert Yulton was the shortest of the bunch, coming in at just 5 feet and 2 inches, but his escapological pedigree stood tall. Like Neville, he was an armed robber, and he had escaped on 3 other occasions, first from Malmesbury as a juvenile, and then most recently from Pentridge in 1982. Though they were all still in their 20s, by this point the men had a combined 10 successful escapes from custody under their belts. They hadn't wound up in Jika by mistake. With a high of just 14 degrees in Melbourne, Saturday the 30th of July 1983 was probably not a day one would wish to spend locked up in Jika. The prison had been celebrated for excellence in concrete, receiving an award to that effect from the Concrete Institute of Australia in 1978. In prison issue overalls and besieged by the blanketing cold of the air conditioning, the men of Jika would probably yearn for the warmth brought by the forced arbitrary labour of their colleagues in H Division. There, prisoners were supplied with hammers and made to break rocks into tiny fragments. They would be passed large bluestones through one trapdoor, and then passed buckets full of the pebbles they broke them into through another. Wright, McGawley, Neville and Yulton may not have been imagining themselves swinging a hammer that morning, but they had been giving considerable thought as to how they were going to break the bluestone walls of Pentridge after dinner that evening. The Age was, at points, engaging in speculation when it published an account 2 days after the escape, based on theories being put forward by Victoria Police. As the Melbourne masthead tells it, the escape began at 8:08 p.m, with an unnamed prisoner being engaged in leatherwork in the corridor outside the day room, which was generating fumes. This led a guard in the control room to open 2 doors leading to the exercise area, one being opened fully and the other raised about 30 centimetres. The unnamed prisoner then requested to return to the cells, so the door between the day room and the cells was opened. As the unnamed prisoner left, the 4 escapees crawled into the room and past the guard's observation booth. The booth was mounted high on a concrete foundation, allowing the men to pass through a blind spot. They continued to crawl on, through the first door to the exercise area, which was fully open, and, with all 4 men being of slight build, under the second door, which was only slightly ajar. Now in the exercise area, the men climbed the outer concrete wall of the prison and forced open a steel lip at the top of the wall, just below the roof. In their artist's impression of the escape, the men appear to ascend up the wall in an almost superhuman fashion before forcing open what appears to be a vent. Using a torch made of a battery, wire and globe, the men felt their way through the area between the roof and the ceiling before smashing their way through a wall to the outside. Another superhuman feat, given none of them had brought a hammer or other appropriate implement. Hugging the wall of Unit 3 to avoid being spotted by the movement-sensitive security cameras, they continued on to a razor wire fence, which the men scaled. At this stage they dumped their equipment, which had become bloodied, suggesting the climb over the razor wire hadn't been without incident. The men now had one brick wall between them and freedom. They passed across the poorly lit, muddy ground between them and the wall, in full view of the multiple observation towers. Fortunately for the escapees, these observation towers were unoccupied after 4:45 p.m, so no alarm was raised. The final wall was scaled by way of a grappling hook, fashioned from a piece of steel. The 4 descended onto Murray Road and made good their escape into the night, where police theorised an outside ally had left a 1970 Fawn Valiant, camping gear, supplies and at least 1 firearm. A passerby spotted the 4 men running off in shorts, runners and light tops and called the police. A report presented to the Kane government suggested that the call came at 8:12 p.m, meaning the entire escape had occurred in the 4 minutes between the phone call and a prison logbook entry at 8:08 p.m. recording the presence of the 4 men. So how accurate is the Age's account? A brief reference in a Herald Sun article from 2012 has a few points of difference with the Age. It suggests that prisoners over a long period groomed guards to leave the doors open to ventilate fumes from the hobby glue used in leatherwork. The miraculous ascent of the men in the exercise yard is substituted for the cutting of the metal cage above the yard, which makes more sense, as a metal cage would be easier to climb than a concrete wall. A version of events which reflects poorly on the warders is related in Don Osborne's Pentridge, Behind the Bluestone Walls, published in 2015. Osborne's retelling fills in a few gaps from the Age's story, such as naming the unnamed leather worker as murderer Trevor Raymond Jolly, but attributed the fumes to spray paint rather than glue. Osborne suggests that, rather than crawling in the day room upon Jolly's exit, the four had been hiding under a workbench when they slipped through the doors to the exercise area. They then used a crowbar to prise open a space in the upper covering of the exercise yard. This view is corroborated by the account provided by the Minister for Community Welfare Services Pauline Toner in the Legislative Assembly on August 9th. They went into a small courtyard area known as the Passive Recreation Area. From here, the escapees climbed up an arc mesh fence to a position above the external window to the day room. There they pulled a sheet of light-gauge fascia steel cladding from the side of the roof. All 4 men then crawled through the roof cavity for about 8 feet before exiting from a similar metal fascia sheet. This account suggests that it was the weak fascia metal that the men had pushed through to break out of the ceiling area, rather than the concrete wall referred to by the Age. The minister also appears to suggest that the alarmed cameras may have picked up the 4 men, but failed to sound the alarm for unknown reasons. In Jailbreak, Wendy Lewis submits that the alarms were designed to be so sensitive that grass blowing in the wind set them off, with the possible implication that the sensor had been disabled due to the number of false positives it had been producing. More specificity is offered in the construction of the makeshift escape tools. Lewis said the crowbar was made from a steel chair leg and that they had used leather gloves to push the razor wire aside. And Osborne proposes the grappling hook that scaled the outer wall was made of bedsheet rope and a hook fashioned from a notice board. One of the more important differences was that, as opposed to the guard's declaration that the prisoners were accounted for at 8:08 p.m, as in the Age's version, Osborne suggests that not only were the prisoners not accounted for, but that duty officers didn't even notice their absence at muster. At any rate, the escape had embarrassed police, guards and the Kane government, but it was not over yet. The aftermath of the escape continued to cause headaches for the Kane government and Minister Toner. The most immediate problem was that these 4 dangerous men were on the loose and had plenty of escape experience to inform their strategies of evading the authorities. Dogs were set to sniff out the men that evening, but conflicting scents in different directions confused the dogs and allowed the men to evade immediate capture. The 4 made for the bush, being spotted at Montrose while heading for the town of Bonnydoon in Victoria's northeast, where they tied up 2 council cleaners in a toilet block on the 1st of August. A police search effort amongst the largest in Victoria's history began, as they attempted to catch up with them at Bonnydoon, then at Seymour, and then at the Strathbogie Ranges. By the time the search was called off 11 days after the escape, more than 200 police, assisted by dogs and aircraft, had searched hundreds of kilometres for the wanted men. The government could hardly have been more embarrassed. In September, Victoria Police announced they believed Youlton and Neville may have been murdered by, admittedly, convicted murderers Wright and McGawley, given the first 2 had not been seen since early August, and Wright had a history of eliminating anyone who would give evidence against him. On Friday the 16th of September, police found evidence that Wright and McGawley held up a State Bank branch in Spotswood before escaping a police raid on a St Kilda flat they were staying in by mere minutes. Police found vehicles associated with the pair, along with ammunition, weapons, radio scanners and gas masks, suggesting they were prepared for a siege by the police. On the 26th of September, the police were once again hot on the trail, tracking the men to Chum Creek, where a series of raids on the wrong houses were conducted, leading to hundreds of dollars in damages and further embarrassment to the police, who came upon the Wright house after the men had once again fled, when they heard a police helicopter overhead. Things would finally start going the police's way when McGawley's luck ran out the next day, after he was captured outside Healesville, with sources differing as to whether he was asking police for directions or intentionally giving himself up. It appeared that disunity was death for the 4 men, with Neville being picked up outside Eltham on the 29th and Youlton apprehended in a raid on a Diamond Creek home on the 5th of October. Wright, however, had a good trot, remaining at large until New Year's Day 1984, when he was tracked to a house in Dandenong. Police confronted Wright and two associates, who attempted to drive off until an exchange of gunfire caused Wright to crash into a pole, where he was finally recaptured. The Department of Police and Emergency Services said the cost of the manhunt was $500,000, around $1.9 million in today's money. Minister Toner announced a further investment of around $400,000 into equipment and upgrades for Pentridge and other prisons on the 9th of August. While the search for the fugitive men was going on, all was not well back at Jika. 2 guards on duty at the time of the escape had been disciplined and transferred to other duties at Pentridge. In the face of so many other problems, industrial action was the last thing the Kane government needed. On the 1st of August, however, that is precisely what happened, as the guards of Pentridge all walked off the job. Subsequently, all Victorian provincial jails and some correctional centres then also walked off the job in support. By the 6th, the Kane government had declared a state of emergency and invoked laws last used in the 1920s to order the warders back to work, under threat of dismissal. When the strike began, Operation Bluestone was put into action, where police stood guard around the prison while the prisoners received meals from the Salvation Army. The inmates of Pentridge knew that there was chaos unfolding around them, with the Assistant Police Commissioner for Operations, Keith Thompson, suggesting the prisoners were getting a bit uptight, as evidenced by the cacophony of fists pounding on cell doors in the night. The strike would conclude after a week of disruption which had further drained police resources while on the hunt for the 4 escapees, as well as further damaging the government. The guards had won undertakings from the government that there would be action on the overuse of extra shifts, consultation with union officials in the development of revised procedures, and the return of the original 2 guards to normal duties. An inquiry by the Victorian Legislative Council found that conditions within Pentridge were abhorrent, deplorable and dehumanising for prisoners, and that these conditions, along with Victoria's ageing prison infrastructure and inadequate recruitment and training, were contributing to the low morale of prison officers. Moreover, the committee was concerned to note that Victoria's prisons were almost completely full as at 30 June 1983. The terms of reference included investigation into the escape on the 30th of July 1983, but the interim report recommended that it be discharged from this and other points in the terms of reference, as little if anything would be achieved by it pursuing its investigations in the view of the other inquiries which have been or are being carried out. So there is no final version of events of the escape as concluded by the committee. The 4 escapees, following their capture, lived out the remainder of their lives to varying degrees of obscurity. There is no apparent evidence of what happened to David Yulton after his return to Jika, nor is there any information about Timothy Neville, save for a report from the Brosnan Centre, a rehabilitation centre created to help criminals who had served their sentence adjust back into society. The report, which noted Neville as an articulate and at times manipulative resident of the centre, confirmed that he was deceased by 2017. Robert Wright and David Macaulay, on the other hand, would continue to play a part in the history of Pentridge, at great personal expense to themselves. On October 29, 1987, Wright and Macaulay, still residents of Jika, renamed K Division in 1984, joined 3 others in a protest in Unit 4. Sources differ on the cause of the protest. An Age article from 2 days after the protest said that guards believed the transfer of AIDS victims to a separate unit was the catalyst, while Attorney General Jim Kennan suggested that the classification of prisoners was the problem. Wendy Lewis concurs that it was Wright's request to be transferred to a lower security block being refused that sparked the protest. A Herald Sun article from 2013 suggests that the prisoners' goals were to have the unit shut down, to be relocated, and allegedly to try to get compensation. And Osborne suggests it was conditions within K Division that caused the protest. At any rate, the men of Unit 4 were determined to generate a sensation with their protest. At 4 p.m, the protest began with prisoners on either side of the bulletproof glass that separated their unit performing their roles. The men on side 1 barricaded the door with a mattress, table tennis table and books, while the men on side 2 covered windows with newspaper and destroyed security cameras to shield them from view. On side 1, the barricade was subsequently set alight, generating toxic fumes from the foam mattress. Characteristic of Wright and Macaulay's forward-thinking and resourceful natures, the men donned gas masks, crudely made from piping and pieces of hose to protect them from the fumes. The one detail that the men had neglected was that Unit 4 was airtight. The gas masks would do nothing to save them if there was no fresh air coming in. Guards desperately tried to push through the barricade and rescue the men from side 1. They succeeded in evacuating the men of side 2 in time, almost losing a guard who became trapped when attempting to open the doors. By the time they broke through the barricade into side 1, and the smoke ventilated out of the area, the guards found the 5 men lying on the floor asphyxiated. Among the dead, along with Wright and Macaulay, were murderer Ricky Morris and armed robbers James Loughnane and Arthur Gallagher. The day after the fire in 1987, it was announced that Jika would be closed permanently. The government already had plans to close the maximum security division by 1989, but the deaths of the 5 prisoners hastened the shuttering. After Jika closed, the buildings operated as K Division, where some of the most progressive programs for drug and alcohol-dependent inmates and intellectually disabled prisoners were housed, as well as the prison's HIV unit. When the entirety of Pentridge's correctional activities ceased in 1997, K Division was opened to the public as a museum. Tours were held until 1999, when part of Pentridge, including K Division, was sold to a developer. By 2001, any traces of the facility were gone, having been replaced by townhouses. Most of the other buildings were demolished over the years. Tours are still offered at A and B Division, but Pentridge's days of penality are over. Beside the dark imperious walls and buildings of what its occupants called the Bluestone College, now stands the Pentridge Shopping Centre.
Pentridge, why do you make these walls so high? I'm just an ordinary guy, living out my life. Pentridge, why do you